The bar went quiet the second his hand made contact. Corporal Ryan Mercer had been running his mouth for 20 minutes, loud enough that the whole dockside tavern could hear it. But the shove was something else. It snapped through the noise like a gunshot. The woman in the gray jacket barely moved. She set her glass down on the bar with the same deliberate calm she'd had since she walked in, and she looked at him. Just looked at him. No flinch, no tears, no apology. The kind of stillness that should have told Mercer something was wrong, that he was the one standing on the edge of something he couldn't see yet. He laughed instead, turned to his buddies. See? That's all they've got. He had no idea he'd just touched a 4-star admiral. Before you go any further, if you're the kind of person who stays until the moment everything flips, this story is for you. Subscribe to follow along, hit like if you're already feeling it, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Rusty Anchor sat 3 blocks from the naval base and smelled like salt water and old beer and whatever fry oil had been burning in the kitchen since Tuesday. It wasn't a nice place. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the kind of bar that filled up on Friday nights because the base was close and the drinks were cheap, and nobody asked too many questions about rank insignia or the arguments that sometimes spilled out onto the dock. Evelyn Carter had been coming here for 12 years. Not often, maybe 6 times a year when she was passing through the port during transit and wanted somewhere that didn't feel like a briefing room or a formal dinner or a ship's quarterdeck. She had plenty of those. She had an office that looked out over the harbor on the 3rd floor of Pacific Fleet Command. She had a car with a driver and a schedule managed by 2 aides, and a calendar, so full that her personal physician had told her in March, with genuine concern, that she needed to build in sleep the same way she built in meetings. She had all of that. What she didn't have very often was an hour by herself with a club soda and no one calling her Admiral. Tonight she was in transit. Flight from Pearl was delayed by a maintenance issue, rescheduled for ZO 600 the next morning, and her hotel wasn't check-in ready until 9. She had 2 hours to fill, and she didn't want to sit in an airport lounge or pace a lobby. She'd taken a cab to the Rusty Anchor. She was wearing civilian clothes. Gray jacket, dark slacks, plain watch. No rank insignia, no lanyard, no visible indication of anything other than a woman in her early 50s sitting alone at the bar with a glass of sparkling water and a bowl of peanuts she'd been working through slowly. Her hair was pulled back in the kind of no-nonsense bun she defaulted to when she wasn't thinking about it. She looked tired because she was tired. She looked unremarkable because that was exactly what she'd come here to be. The group of Marines came in around 7:15, 4 of them, young, early 20s, maybe a couple pushing 25. Still had that particular energy that came from a recent deployment and a Friday night and no duties until Monday. They were loud when they walked in, the way people are loud when they feel like the room should acknowledge them, and the room mostly did. The bartender, a stocky man named Walt, who had been pouring drinks here for 9 years, glanced up and then went back to restocking the rail. A couple of older guys at a corner table shifted in their seats and studied their beers. 2 women near the jukebox turned slightly away. Evelyn didn't move. The group settled into the far end of the bar, 3 stools down from her. She could see them in the mirror behind the shelves of liquor without turning her head. The one in front, the one who seemed to consider himself the center of the group's gravity, ordered first and loudest, some domestic beer with an attitude like he was doing the bartender a favor. His name, she'd learn later, was Mercer. Corporal Ryan Mercer. 23 years old, 18 months in, recently returned from a rotation in Okinawa that had apparently done wonders for his confidence and nothing at all for his judgment. He noticed her almost immediately. She could tell by the way he positioned himself. He didn't approach right away. He worked up to it the way men like him usually did, with a few comments to his buddies that were loud enough to be heard, testing whether she'd react. Something about women who drink alone. Something about the seat she'd chosen, the one closest to the door, which was apparently significant to him for reasons she didn't try to follow. She drank her club soda, ate a peanut, watched the baseball game on the TV above the rail. Walt refilled her glass without being asked and gave her a look she recognized, one that said, "You want me to say something?" She gave the smallest possible shake of her head. He went back to wiping down the rail. Mercer took this as encouragement. He moved closer. One stool, then another. His friends hung back slightly, the way audiences hang back from performers, present, entertained, not yet committed to the consequences. "You waiting for someone?" he asked. His voice had the practiced confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned that confidence without competence is just noise. "No," Evelyn said, sitting alone on a Friday night, at the Anchor. He looked around with exaggerated concern. "That's kind of sad." She didn't answer. "I'm just saying, this isn't really the place for—" He gestured vaguely in her direction, at the jacket, at her in general. "This." "I've been coming here longer than you've been in uniform," she said, still looking at the television. "That was a mistake. Not because it was wrong, so it was completely accurate, but because it gave him something to push against. She knew that. She'd said it anyway, which was perhaps its own kind of mistake, the kind that comes from being too tired to manage small provocations carefully." He laughed. "Yeah, okay." Then to his friends, "She's been coming here longer than I've been in uniform." His friends laughed. One of them said something she didn't catch but caught the tone of. She let it go. Ate another peanut. The baseball game was in the seventh. The problem with Mercer, and she would think about this later, much later, in the context of what he actually was versus what he was performing, was that the absence of response read to him as absence of power. He had been trained in a culture that confused reaction with strength and silence with submission, and nothing in his 18 months had corrected that misreading. He had learned that rank was something you wore on your collar and announced with your volume and defended by making other people feel smaller. He had not yet learned that the most dangerous people in any room are usually the quietest ones. "What do you even do?" he asked. He had moved to the stool directly beside her now, one arm on the bar, beer in hand, performing casualness. Like, "What's the job?" "Government work," Evelyn said. "Government work." He repeated it slowly, with the specific brand of contempt reserved for things that sound vague. "Administrative, probably. Paper pusher type." "Something like that." "Yeah." He nodded. "That tracks." He took a drink. "You know, this bar's kind of a Navy and Marine spot. People come here after long days, hard days. Not really a desk job kind of place." She looked at him then, just briefly, directly, long enough that something in his expression shifted. Not quite uncertainty, but a flicker of something that might become it. She looked away before it had time to develop. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Walt was watching from the far end of the bar. The two women near the jukebox had gone quiet. One of Mercer's friends was pulling at his sleeve now, saying something low. "Maybe, come on, let it go." But Mercer had an audience and an absence of pushback, and he made the choice that people with his particular combination of youth and arrogance almost always make. He escalated. "I'm being serious," he said, louder now. "Women don't really belong in places like this. I'm not trying to be a jerk about it. It's just how it is." "Ryan," one of his friends started, "I'm just saying what everyone thinks." Evelyn put down her glass, very deliberately, the same way she put down a pen when she'd made a final decision in a briefing. "Then everyone should say it louder so they can be held to it later." Mercer blinked. Something had changed in her voice. Not volume, not anger, just a quality that hadn't been there before. A precision that didn't match the tired civilian woman who'd been eating peanuts and watching baseball. His brain didn't process it correctly. What it did instead was translate unexpected resistance as challenge, and he reacted to challenges the way he'd been trained to, by pressing forward. He stood up from the bar stool. "Look, I'm not trying to start anything. I'm just saying this isn't—" And then he put his hand on her shoulder. Not a grab, not a strike, but a shove. Small, dismissive. The kind of physical punctuation that says you're not serious, go away. The bar went silent. Evelyn had not flinched. She sat exactly as she had been sitting, both hands now on the bar, glass in front of her, looking straight ahead. The physical stillness was so complete that for a moment it seemed like maybe the shove hadn't happened, like the room had collectively misread it. Then she exhaled. It wasn't a dramatic exhale. It wasn't performed. It was the exhale of someone who has just received information that requires a decision, the kind of micro-pause that happens in command when circumstances shift and the next 30 seconds will determine the shape of everything that follows. She turned and looked at Mercer, fully this time. He was still standing, still holding his beer, still in the glow of his own momentum. But something had drained slightly from his expression. The flicker was back, stronger now. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was quiet, completely, professionally quiet. Mercer's jaw tightened. He was about to say something, she could see it forming, when the device in her jacket pocket vibrated. Not once, 3 times, the pattern that meant priority 1. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a phone that was not, in any way, a standard civilian device. Black, ruggedized, no visible carrier branding, a satellite communications unit. She looked at the screen. The color of the alert was red. She was off the bar stool before she'd fully processed the decision to move, already pressing the authentication sequence, already moving toward the quieter end of the bar near the emergency exit where the ambient noise was lowest. Mercer said something behind her. She didn't register what. And she pushed the call through on the 3rd security prompt. "Carter," she said. The voice on the other end was Lieutenant Commander Yolanda Prentice, her operations officer, and the fact that Prentice was calling this number rather than the standard line told Evelyn everything about the severity before a single word of the brief. "Admiral, we have a situation. Typhoon Isolde changed track about 90 minutes ago. Current models put it intersecting the carrier strike group at approximately 0300. USS Kestrel and USS Vandermoor are already in heavy seas. Kestrel's reporting structural integrity concerns on the aft flight deck. Horizon is attempting reposition, but they're running out of sea room." Evelyn pressed her free hand against her ear to block the bar noise. "What's Admiral Trask saying?" "Admiral Trask's comms went down 40 minutes ago. We've been unable to reach him directly. His chief of staff is managing on deck, but they're requesting fleet-level authorization for emergency repositioning corridors." "What's the current position of the strike group?" Prentice gave coordinates. Evelyn did the calculation without paper, the same way she always had, the numbers arranged in her mind with the clarity of something practiced so long it no longer required conscious effort. "If they maintain current heading, they're moving into the worst quadrant of that system," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And if they alter course northeast, 20-knot window for approximately 4 hours. After that, the Typhoon's outer bands will close it. They have to move now." She was already processing the authorization requirements, who had operational command in Trask's absence, what the precedent was for fleet-level redirection, whether she had the standing to issue orders while technically in transit. She had the standing. She'd had it for 4 years. "Pull up the Fleet Authorization Protocol, Section 7, Emergency Displacement. I'll need to issue a formal command order." "Ready when you are, Admiral." She turned back toward the bar. The room had gone extremely quiet. She hadn't realized until now that the jukebox had stopped. Walt was standing behind the bar with both hands flat on the surface, watching her. The women near the jukebox were watching. Mercer's friends were watching. Mercer was watching. She didn't have time to address any of them. "Prentice, connect me to Horizon's acting command element and get me weather on the northeast corridor every 30 minutes. "Connecting now." She spent the next 11 minutes moving between the emergency exit and the quiet back corner of the bar, issuing orders with the compressed efficiency of someone who had done this in far worse conditions than a dockside tavern on a Friday night. She authorized the repositioning corridor. She directed the destroyer escorts to picket formation around the carrier to provide sea room. She coordinated with the meteorological team for updated typhoon track projections and got on a direct line with Horizon's acting XO, a Commander Waverly, who sounded like he'd been awake for 30 hours and was barely holding the professional edge in his voice. "Ma'am, we have 15 aircraft that need to be moved below decks before we can alter course at speed. That's a 30-minute operation minimum." "You have 25, she said. "Start now. I'll get you the window authorization. Don't wait for the paperwork. Move the planes. I'll cover it." "Yes, Admiral." She pulled up the secondary line and dictated the authorization code to Prentice at the same time. 2 conversations, parallel tracks, the kind of multitasking that looked like a gift to people who hadn't seen the 10,000 hours behind it. When she finally closed the call, both lines, sequentially, the bar was still quiet. She stood near the back wall for a moment. She was aware of being observed. The adrenaline of the operational crisis was still moving through her system, which was why it took a beat longer than usual to return to the ordinary geography of the room. The bar, the bottles, the television above the rail, still showing the baseball game, now in the 8th. She walked back to her bar stool. She sat down. She picked up her club soda. Nobody said anything. Then the front door opened. Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Whitaker was a large man, not large in the showy way that some career military men became, but large in the way of someone who had been physically demanding of himself for so long that size had simply accumulated. I was 51 years old, gray at the temples, wearing civilian clothes that somehow still looked like a uniform because of the way he carried himself inside them. He'd been the senior enlisted advisor for Pacific Fleet Command for 3 years. He knew every admiral in the fleet on a first-name basis, which meant he also knew every admiral by sight, in any lighting, in any context. He had come to the Rusty Anchor because Walt had called the base when things started getting heated, which was the protocol Walt had established years ago for exactly these kinds of situations. He stepped inside, looked around. His eyes went to Evelyn at the bar, and something in his expression did the specific work of a man recalibrating his understanding of what he'd walked into. He'd expected a bar fight. What he found was an admiral in a gray jacket sitting alone with a club soda while every other person in the room stood in the particular paralysis of people who have just witnessed something they don't have the framework to explain. Whitaker walked to the bar. He didn't look at Mercer. He looked at Evelyn. "Evening, ma'am," he said. "Master Chief," she said. He looked at the phone on the bar. He looked at the room. He did the math. "You just ran an emergency op from this corner of the bar," he said. It was not a question. "Typhoon displacement, carrier strike group, should be through the worst of it by 0400. Whitaker nodded slowly. "The call sign Prentice used when she reached me to confirm the authorization chain, she said it came through Sea Dragon clearance. That's correct?" He turned then. Slowly, with the full deliberate weight of 28 years in uniform. He turned and looked at Corporal Mercer, who was still standing where he'd been standing, beer now hanging from his hand like he'd forgotten it was there, color doing something complicated in his face. Whitaker's voice dropped to the register he used when he wanted every syllable to carry. "Attention on deck." It was automatic. It hit every service member in the room before their conscious minds could process it, and every one of them snapped to Mercer, his 3 friends, 2 other sailors who'd been at a table near the back and hadn't been involved in any of it. The physical response of training overriding thought. Whitaker waited until the room was still. "This," he said, "is Admiral Evelyn Carter, Commander, Pacific Fleet. 4 stars. 26 years of commissioned service, including 2 combat deployments and operational command of the USS Kestrel during the Straits engagement in 2019. He let that land. She has just from this bar, using a Priority 1 satellite link, directed emergency repositioning of an entire carrier strike group through a Category 4 typhoon." He paused. "So if there is anyone in this room who would like to revisit the choices they made in the last hour, now would be an excellent time to think very carefully." Mercer's beer glass hit the bar rail. He hadn't dropped it. His hand had just stopped working right. Evelyn did not look at him. She looked at Whitaker, and something passed between them. Not quite amusement, not quite satisfaction, something quieter and more complicated. The look of 2 people who had seen enough of the world to know that moments like this one were less about victory than about gravity. Things falling where they were always going to fall. "I'd like another club soda, Walt," she said. Walt reached for the soda gun. His hand was steady, but barely. The baseball game played on above them. Top of the 9th. Visitors up by 2. The crowd on the television cheered for something, and the sound of it was the only thing that moved in the Rusty Anchor for a long, suspended moment. While Corporal Ryan Mercer stood at attention in front of a woman he'd shoved 20 minutes ago and tried to locate, somewhere in the geography of his certainty, where exactly everything had gone so completely wrong. The answer was everywhere. It had gone wrong everywhere. And the worst part, the part that was already sitting in his chest like something cold and permanent, was that she still hadn't looked at him. Not once. I was still at attention when she picked up her glass, and he was still at attention when Whitaker walked to the far end of the bar and made a call on his own phone. A short call, 3 words that Mercer couldn't hear but that he somehow already knew the shape of. And the door opened again 40 seconds later to admit 2 officers in uniform, a lieutenant commander and a captain, who had clearly come from the base and had clearly come for him. He stood very straight. He stood very straight because it was the only thing he knew how to do, because every other form of response had been stripped out of him in the last 4 minutes, and because the woman in the gray jacket was still sitting at the bar with her club soda and her peanuts, watching the baseball game as if he had not crossed his mind at all. She raised her glass slightly as the visitors tied it up in the 9th, and Ryan Mercer, for the first time in as long as he could remember, had absolutely nothing to say. The 2 officers who walked through the door of the Rusty Anchor were not the kind of men who moved quickly. They moved with the specific deliberateness of people who had learned that urgency, visibly performed, undermines authority. Lieutenant Commander Gus Farrell and Captain Jerome Okafor crossed the room at the same pace they would have crossed a quarterdeck, and the room parted for them the way rooms always parted for that kind of bearing. Farrell had a folder under his arm. Okafor had nothing visible, which somehow felt more significant. They stopped short of Mercer. Not at him, short of him, the way you stop short of something you haven't decided how to handle yet. Okafor looked at Whitaker. Whitaker gave him the brief compressed nod that communicated everything a verbal briefing would have taken 10 minutes to cover. Okafor looked at Mercer. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was still watching the baseball game with the particular focus of someone who was watching the baseball game and nothing else. "Admiral Carter," Okafor said. "Captain." She didn't turn around. "We can have him transported tonight if you'd like to file a formal—" "I know what I can do, Captain." She set her glass down. "I'll be in touch in the morning." There was a beat, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted. And then Okafor turned back to Mercer. "Corporal, you're coming with us." Mercer moved. He moved the way you move when the floor has gone soft under you, and you're not sure where to put your weight, carefully and without looking at anyone directly, and he was almost to the door when Evelyn spoke. She didn't raise her voice. "Corporal Mercer." He stopped. She still hadn't turned around. She was looking at the television, at the game, at the 10th inning that had materialized out of the 9th's tie. She picked up a peanut. She said, "I know what you thought when you looked at me tonight. I'm not angry about it. People make that mistake more than you'd think." She paused. "But you put your hands on someone. That part is not a misunderstanding. That part you're going to have to carry." Silence. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. The door closed behind him, and the two officers and the rusty anchor breathed for the first time in 40 minutes. Walt poured himself a short glass of something amber without asking anyone's permission, and the two women near the jukebox found each other's eyes and exchanged a look that communicated approximately 9 separate things simultaneously. Whitaker pulled out the bar stool next to Evelyn and sat down without being invited, which he could do because she'd told him to stop asking permission for things like that 4 years ago. He flagged Walt for a coffee. He looked at the game. Then he said, "How long have you been coming to this bar?" "Since the Kestrel deployment." "That's 12 years. "I'm aware of how long it's been, Daniel." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have called in your location. I was off duty." "You are never off duty. You know you're never off duty." "I know." She ate the peanut. "I wanted to be for a couple of hours." Whitaker wrapped both hands around the mug Walt placed in front of him and stared into it. He was one of maybe 7 people on Earth who could sit next to Admiral Evelyn Carter and tell her things she didn't want to hear without managing the conversation like it was a hostage negotiation. He had earned that. She had given it to him deliberately, because she understood that people in her position needed at least one person who would tell them the truth without calculating the cost first. "Mercer's been flagged twice before," he said. "Conduct issues. Nothing that went to formal paper. Both times a supervisor covered it." "I know. Prentice pulled his record while I was on the call." "Then you also know his supervisor is Staff Sergeant Garland, who's been covering problems instead of solving them for about as long as Mercer's been making them." "Yes." "So this isn't just about tonight?" "No," she said. "It's not." Whitaker drank his coffee. "What do you want to do?" She thought about it. Not for long. The shape of what needed to happen had been forming since the moment Farrell and Okafor walked in, but she gave it the courtesy of genuine consideration rather than instinct dressed up as deliberation. That was a habit she'd built consciously, the discipline of pausing before the decision that felt obvious, because obvious decisions made in under 10 seconds were how careers ended and people got hurt. "I want a formal inquiry," she said. "Full documentation. His record, Garland's record, anything connected to those 2 prior flags. I want the inquiry conducted by someone outside their chain. That'll take it above the base level." "Yes." "That's going to make some people uncomfortable." "Good." She finished her club soda. Discomfort is the beginning of every conversation worth having. She left the anchor at 8:40. The car Whitaker had called for her was a plain sedan, not a staff vehicle, another consideration she hadn't asked for but accepted. And the driver was a young petty officer who did not try to make conversation, which was either excellent training or excellent instinct. Either way, she was grateful for it. She sat in the back and watched the harbor lights move past the window and let the operational adrenaline finish draining out of her system the way it always drained, slowly, leaving a residue of clarity that felt almost like calm but had a different texture underneath. The typhoon update came through at 9:15. Horizon and her escorts had successfully repositioned. Kestrel was reporting the structural concern on the aft deck as manageable under reduced speed. All personnel accounted for. The storm's outer bands would reach them in approximately 6 hours, and the strike group was now positioned to take them at the best possible angle. Commander Waverly had sent a brief message through official channels that said only, "Corridor held." "Thank you, Admiral." 20 seconds of text that represented, she knew, somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 sailors who would sleep through a typhoon tonight instead of fighting one. She put the phone down. The hotel was a mid-range place 2 miles from the airport. Nothing remarkable. She'd stayed here before. She had a system for transit hotels the same way she had systems for most things, choosing places that were quiet and reliable and close to the airport and not trying to be anything other than what they were. She checked in under her name because she'd stopped checking in under pseudonyms after an aide had pointed out gently that it created more complications than it solved. The clerk recognized the name. She always knew when they did. There was a slight recalibration, a fractional widening, a different quality of attention. This one was young, maybe 22, and he managed it well enough, just asked if she had any preferences for her floor, and told her breakfast started at 6 and handed her the keycard without making it into anything. She was in bed by 10. She did not sleep particularly well. This was not unusual. She hadn't slept particularly well since approximately 2011, a fact she had made peace with the way you made peace with a knee that wouldn't fully bend anymore, functionally, without drama, with a clear-eyed acknowledgement that some things didn't fully recover, and life continued anyway. She was awake at 4:30 when her phone vibrated with the storm update. Horizon through the outer bands. Light damage to 2 aircraft on the flight deck. 0 casualties. She read the report twice, sent a one-line response to Prentice. "Good work tonight, all of you." And lay in the dark for another hour thinking about Ryan Mercer. Not with anger. She'd meant that in the bar. What she felt when she thought about him was something more like the tired recognition of a pattern she'd seen enough times that it no longer surprised her, but still, always, bothered her. Young, undertrained in the things that mattered, given just enough authority to feel powerful and not enough accountability to understand what power actually meant. She'd met 50 versions of Mercer in 26 years. Some of them had been salvageable. Some hadn't. The difference, she had found, was almost never about the person and almost always about who got to them first with the right kind of pressure. Garland hadn't been the right kind. He'd been the wrong kind. The kind that smoothed things over, that calculated the cost of confrontation and chose avoidance, that mistook the absence of formal complaint for the absence of a problem. The kind that created, over time, young men who believed that behavior without consequences was behavior that was acceptable. She got up at 5:15, showered, dressed, had coffee from the machine in the room that was terrible but hot, and sat at the desk by the window with her laptop and the preliminary inquiry request she'd asked Prentice to draft overnight. Prentice had done more than draft it. She'd built a timeline going back 14 months, cross-referenced incident reports, and attached 3 statements from other personnel on Mercer's base who had apparently been waiting for someone to ask. The most recent statement was from a Lance Corporal named Deirdre Osman, 21 years old, who described an incident from 6 weeks ago that was worse than what had happened in the Anchor and had been formally filed, then quietly reclassified as resolved, by Garland. Evelyn read it twice. She picked up her phone. It was 5:42 in the morning. She called Captain Okafor. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been awake and waiting. "Admiral? I've read Prentice's file. I want the scope of the inquiry expanded. To include Garland. And anyone above Garland who touched those prior reports." She paused. "I also want the Osman incident treated as a primary matter, not a secondary one. What happened to her needs to be addressed on its own terms, not as context for what happened to me." There was a brief silence on the line. Not hesitation, she recognized, but the silence of a man making sure he understood precisely. "Understood, Admiral." "Good. I'll be in the office by 1400. We can debrief then." She hung up and looked at the window. The harbor was still dark out there, but the sky had the particular quality of pre-dawn that always felt to her like something was about to change. Her flight was on time for once. She landed at Pearl at 8:50 and was in her office by 10, which gave her 4 hours before Okafor's debrief and approximately 40 minutes before her morning brief, which Prentice ran with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. The office looked out over the harbor the way it always did. The water was flat and pale blue under high overcast. She could see the outlines of ships at dock and the faint movement of a working tug pushing something heavy toward the fuel pier. Normal. Deliberately, routinely normal. The morning brief was the usual accumulation. Status updates from the strike group, personnel reports, logistics, a briefing on a procurement issue she needed to weigh in on by end of week, a request from a rear admiral in Guam for guidance on an operational question that was really a political question dressed up in operational language. She moved through it efficiently and let herself get almost to the end before Prentice cleared her throat. "There's something else, Admiral." Evelyn looked up. "The incident at the Rusty Anchor last night." Prentice was careful with her words in the way of someone who'd thought about exactly how to phrase something. "It's in circulation. Define in circulation. 3 people in the bar last night had phones out at various points. We don't know exactly what was recorded or when, but there's footage on at least 2 platforms as of 6 this morning." She set a tablet on the desk. "It's moving." Evelyn looked at the screen. The footage was phone quality, shot from the direction of the jukebox, and it showed approximately 40 seconds of her standing near the back wall of the bar with the satellite phone pressed to her ear, voice inaudible over the bar noise, face turned away. Then it cut. Edited, she noted, which meant someone had been paying attention, to the moment Whitaker came in and spoke. And while his exact words weren't clearly audible, the physical response of every uniformed person in the room was. The automatic attention, the stillness. The caption under the video read, "Woman at bar gets shoved by Marine. Turns out she runs the fleet." His face when he realized. It had 400,000 views. She put the tablet down. She looked at Prentice. "How old is the person who wrote that caption?" "I genuinely don't know, Admiral. It sounds like a teenager wrote it." "It's performing very well for a teenager." Evelyn picked up her coffee. She thought about this problem with the same framework she thought about all problems. What is it? What does it affect? What can be controlled and what cannot? What is the right action in the available space? The footage wasn't damaging, exactly. She wasn't doing anything wrong in it, but it had turned a disciplinary matter into a story, and stories develop their own momentum independent of the facts inside them, and the story this video was constructing was one she hadn't chosen and couldn't fully steer. "Is there a request from Public Affairs?" "They'd like a statement." "Tell them I'll provide one when the formal inquiry has produced something worth commenting on. Until then, no statement, no interview, nothing that treats this as a public matter before it's been addressed as an institutional one." Prentice wrote something. "There's also a call request from Vice Admiral Drummond." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "When?" "Came in at 7 this morning, flagged as personal, not official." Marcus Drummond was the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Personnel. He was also in the specific taxonomy of people who occupied her professional world, a man who had spent the last 3 years managing the distance between his own ambitions and her seniority with the careful precision of someone diffusing something that might go off. They were not friends. They were not enemies. They were 2 people who understood each other's positions clearly and communicated through the specific politeness of people who know they are being watched. A call flagged as personal from Marcus Drummond at 7 in the morning after a night when her name went viral was not a personal call. "Tell him I'll return it after 1400, she said, "after Okafor's debrief." "Yes, ma'am." Prentice left. Evelyn turned back to the window and the harbor and the flat blue water and thought about what Drummond might want to say to her before the inquiry had even formally opened. She thought about the word personal and what work it was being asked to do in that context. She thought about Deirdre Osman, 21 years old, whose complaint had been reclassified as resolved by a man who should have been protecting her. She thought about 400,000 people watching 40 seconds of footage and drawing conclusions and not knowing any of those things. The debrief at 1400 was tighter than she expected. Okafor had moved quickly. She appreciated that about him, the lack of preamble, the efficiency. And by the time she sat down across from him and Farrell, The inquiry had already been formally opened, and 3 additional witness statements had come in voluntarily from personnel on the base who'd heard the inquiry was real and decided that meant it was safe to say what they knew. Garland's been informed, Okafor said. He's requested to speak to his JAG representative before any formal interview. That's his right. Of course it is, Evelyn said. What's Mercer's status? Confined to barracks. Voluntary, technically, but he's not going anywhere. Farrell glanced at his folder. He's been cooperative so far. His JAG rep has advised him to be cooperative. His rep advised him well. She looked at the witness statements. Osmond's was at the top. She'd read it 3 times already, but she read it again because it deserved to be read as many times as it took to make sure nothing in it was missed. I want to make sure the Osmond matter is not absorbed into the larger inquiry in a way that makes it less visible. It needs to be addressed as what it is. We understand, Okafor said. I want to meet with her before the end of the week, not in an official capacity, not on the record, just, she paused, just so she knows someone is paying attention. There was a brief moment, she saw it, the fractional exchange between Okafor and Farrell, and she understood what it communicated, that this was unusual, that admirals did not generally make direct contact with junior personnel before a formal inquiry was resolved, that there were protocols designed specifically to prevent anything that could look like pressure or influence. I know what it looks like, she said. Schedule it through proper channels, document it, have JAG present if she wants representation. I'm not trying to go around anything. I just think someone ought to sit across a table from her and say, we hear you. Is that a problem? No, Admiral, Okafor said. Good. The Drummond call came at 1540, which was late enough that she'd had time to eat something. A sandwich from the commissary that she'd consumed in approximately 4 minutes while reading the weather report on the strike group, and early enough that she wasn't yet exhausted, which was the window she preferred for conversations she expected to require precision. She took it in her office, door closed, Prentice on the other side of it, with standing instructions to hold everything for 30 minutes. Marcus, she said. Evelyn. Drummond had a voice built for conference rooms, measured, resonant, the kind of voice that always sounded like it was making a point even when it was just saying hello. I'm glad I caught you. You've been trying since 7 this morning. I have. He didn't apologize for it. I imagine you know why. I have a guess. The video is at 2.1 million views as of an hour ago. He said it the way you say a number when you want the number itself to make your argument. It's been picked up by 3 news services. There's a piece in progress at 2 of the major outlets. One of them is calling it, and I want to be precise here so you know exactly what we're dealing with. The admiral who ran a crisis from a bar while being harassed by one of her own. Evelyn was quiet. That headline is going to do things, Drummond said. Regardless of the facts, regardless of the inquiry, regardless of how carefully this is handled. You understand that. I understand it, Marcus. I'm not naive about it. Then you understand why I'm calling. The measured voice shifted, fractionally. There are people in this building who are going to want to manage the narrative, who are going to want this to be a human interest story about a moment of vindication, resolved cleanly, over in a news cycle. And there are other people who are going to want to use it differently, who are going to point at the systemic issues your inquiry is about to surface and say this is symptomatic of something much larger. They'd be right, Evelyn said. Silence. They would be right, she said again. And I'm not going to participate in framing it as a moment of vindication that resolves cleanly, because it doesn't resolve cleanly. Deirdre Osmond is 21 years old, and her complaint was buried by a staff sergeant who should have known better and signed off on by whoever signed off on it above him. And the reason we're having this conversation is that nothing happened until the wrong woman got shoved in a bar. That's not a feel-good story, Marcus. That's a system problem. The silence this time was longer. Evelyn. His voice had gone somewhere she hadn't heard it go before. Not harder exactly, but denser. I need you to understand something. There are people above both of us who would prefer this to be handled in a way that, I know what they'd prefer, she said, and I want you to understand something. This inquiry is going to go wherever the evidence takes it, and if the evidence takes it somewhere uncomfortable, that's where it's going, she paused. If you're calling to ask me to scope it differently, the answer is no. I'm not asking that. Good. I'm warning you, he said. There's a difference. She held the phone against her ear. She looked at the harbor through her window. A container ship was moving out past the channel buoys, slow and enormous, pushing a wake that wouldn't reach the shore for another 10 minutes. "Thank you for the warning, Marcus," she said. "I'll be in touch." She set the phone down. She sat with the silence for a moment. Not because she was troubled by what Drummond had said, she'd expected most of it, but because she was locating precisely the weight of what the next few weeks were going to require. She had run carrier strike groups through Category 4 typhoons. She had managed crises in real time from worse locations than a dockside bar. She understood the mechanics of pressure, the way it built, and the specific point at which it stopped being manageable by individual effort and started requiring structural solutions. What she had not fully anticipated was how quickly the outside world had decided to become part of this. 2.1 million views. She was still thinking about what that meant, what it set in motion, what it demanded, what it took out of her hands before she'd had a chance to decide whether she wanted it there, when Prentice knocked twice and opened the door. "Admiral, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a development." Evelyn turned. Prentice was holding a folder, and her expression had the specific quality of someone delivering something they've already decided cannot be softened. "Garland," Prentice said. Before his JAG interview, he reached out directly to two of the witnesses whose statements came in this afternoon. She set the folder on the desk. "We think he was trying to find out what they said." Evelyn looked at the folder. She didn't open it yet. "Do we know if he made contact?" "With one of them, yes. The other didn't respond." Prentice paused. "The one he reached, Lance Corporal Osman." The folder sat on the desk between them, and the harbor outside the window was going gray in the late afternoon light, and Evelyn Carter felt the shape of the next 12 hours rearranging itself into something considerably more serious than it had been 30 seconds ago. She opened the folder. The contact log was 3 pages. Prentice had already flagged the relevant sections in yellow. 2 phone calls from a number registered to Garland's personal cell, placed at 1420 and 1451, both to a number that matched the contact information Osman had provided when she submitted her statement that morning. The first call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The second lasted 9. Evelyn read through the flagged sections twice. Then she closed the folder. "Who else knows about this?" "Okafor, as of about 8 minutes ago. He's the one who flagged it to me." Prentice kept her voice level. "Osman called the inquiry line after the second call. She was, her words, not sure if she was supposed to report it, but it felt wrong." "She was right to report it." Evelyn stood. "Where is she now?" "Still on base. Barracks." "I want JAG involved in the next 30 minutes. Not as a formality, actually involved, protective function, her rights explained to her clearly. And I want Garland's interview moved up." She picked up the folder. "Tonight if his rep will agree to it." "And if they won't?" "Then tomorrow at 07, and we document the delay." She moved toward the door. "Get me Okafor." Okafor was in the conference room down the hall with Farrell and a JAG lieutenant named Soraya Mendes, who Evelyn had worked with twice before and trusted, which was a shorter list than most people assumed. Mendes was 34, sharp in the specific way of people who had come up through difficult cases and learned to see the institutional machinery clearly without becoming cynical about it. She had a legal pad in front of her, covered in notes she'd apparently been taking before Evelyn walked in. "Tell me what Osman said when she called," Evelyn said, pulling out a chair. Mendes looked at her notes. She said Garland called her twice. First call, he asked how she was doing. General. She said it felt like he was checking whether she was scared. Second call, he was more direct. He said he heard there was an inquiry starting, and he wanted her to know that things could get complicated for junior personnel who got involved in something above their level. Mendes paused. He didn't threaten her explicitly. He didn't have to. "Witness intimidation doesn't require a direct threat," Evelyn said. "No, it does not." "Can we move on that tonight?" "The call logs are documented. Her statement is documented. She's willing to put it in writing." Mendes tapped her pen against the pad. "The question is whether we treat this as an additional charge or fold it into the existing inquiry as aggravating conduct." "Separate charge," Evelyn said. "I don't want it absorbed into anything. It needs to stand on its own because it represents something different than what he did before. Before tonight, Garland was a man who failed to act. Tonight, he acted. That's a different category." Farrell nodded. Okafor was writing something. Mendes said, I'll need about an hour to draft the formal language. You have it. Evelyn looked at Okafor. Garland's JAG rep? Lieutenant Hollis. He's been notified. He said his client would be available for interview tomorrow at 9. Tell him 07, or we note the delay in the formal record. Okafor picked up his phone. The next 3 hours moved the way the worst operational hours always moved. Not fast, exactly, but compressed. Each task generating 2 more. The paperwork and the phone calls, and the coordination accumulating into a structure that had to be built correctly the first time because there would be people later looking for any crack in the foundation. Evelyn stayed in the conference room until nearly 1900, going through documentation with Mendes and Okafor, and at one point Prentice appeared in the doorway with a plate of food from the commissary that Evelyn ate without tasting because her body needed it, and her mind was elsewhere. She met with Deirdre Osman at 1840. The young lance corporal came in with Mendes beside her as legal support and sat across the table from Evelyn with her hands folded on the surface and her posture very straight in the way of someone who was working hard to look like they weren't frightened. She was small, not short exactly, but compact, with the kind of economy of movement that sometimes came from growing up in spaces where taking up too much room had consequences. She had a bruise, faded yellow-green along the left side of her jaw that was approximately 3 weeks old. Evelyn noticed it. She didn't comment on it immediately. She let Mendes explain the protections, the process, the right to have any statement reviewed before it was finalized. She watched Osman listen with the careful attention of someone parsing every word for hidden obligation. When Mendes finished, Evelyn said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to be clear that this is not for the record, not yet, and you are not required to answer. I'm asking because I want to understand, not because I need it for the file." Osman looked at her. She had dark eyes and the particular wariness of someone who had been told they were being protected before and learned what that was actually worth. "Okay," she said. "When you filed your report 6 weeks ago, the one Garland reclassified, did anyone above Garland ever follow up with you directly?" Osman was quiet for a moment. "No, ma'am." "Did anyone tell you why it had been reclassified?" "Garland told me it had been reviewed and determined to be a personal conflict, not a conduct issue." Her jaw was very still when she said it. "He told me that the way I'd characterize things was, he said I'd overstated it. He said sometimes people misread situations when they're stressed." Evelyn held the young woman's gaze. "You didn't misread it." Osman's hands tightened slightly on the table. "No, ma'am, I didn't." "I know." Evelyn said it simply, without performance. "I want you to know that what you did today, calling the inquiry line after Garland's calls, that took something. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. I almost didn't call." Osman's voice was careful. "I sat there for about 20 minutes thinking about whether it would make things worse." "What made you do it?" The young woman thought about this. "The fact that he called twice," she said finally. "The first call I could explain to myself. The second one I couldn't." Evelyn nodded. That was the kind of clarity that came from paying very close attention to the way things actually were, rather than the way you needed them to be. It was a harder skill than it sounded. A lot of people never developed it. She left Osman with Mendes at 1910 and walked back down the hall toward her office and felt the accumulated weight of the day settle into her shoulders the way it always did when things had been serious for too long without a break. She was 61 hours from the flight she'd missed. She was 2.1 million video views away from the quiet bar she'd wanted for a couple of hours. She was one phone call from Drummond away from a conversation about institutional optics that she was going to have whether she wanted to or not. She made coffee in her office instead. It was bad coffee. The machine had needed replacement for 4 months and no one had gotten around to it. But it was hot, and it was hers, and she drank it at her desk and read the evening update from the strike group and let herself, for approximately 12 minutes, not be managing anything. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting her own formal statement for the inquiry record. She wrote for an hour and 40 minutes. She wrote it the way she wrote all significant documents, slowly, testing each sentence for precision, reading it back aloud at intervals because the ear caught things the eye missed. She described the events at the Rusty Anchor in chronological order without embellishment and without minimization. She included the exact words Mercer had used, the physical contact, the duration and context. She included the operational emergency and her response to it because it was relevant, Not as mitigation, not as contrast, just as fact. She included the conversation with Whitaker. She did not include what she'd been thinking about Mercer. That was not the record's business. When she finished, she read it through twice and sent it to Mendes for review. Then she shut the laptop and looked at the harbor. The lights were on across the water. The container ship she'd watched leave in the afternoon was gone now, somewhere out in the dark beyond the channel. She thought about Drummond's warning. There are people above both of us who would prefer this to be handled in a way that... She had cut him off before he finished. She'd known what the end of the sentence was, and she hadn't wanted to hear it said out loud by someone she respected, even provisionally, because once things were said out loud, they took on a different kind of reality. They required a different kind of response. But she thought about it now, alone, honestly. She thought about the shape of what Drummond was describing, the instinct of institutions under scrutiny to manage the story before the story managed them. She understood it. She even, in a technical sense, understood its logic. Public narratives about systemic problems created pressure that could be destructive and indiscriminate. They didn't distinguish between the individuals who'd failed and the institution itself. They generated heat without always generating light. She understood all of that. She also understood that Deirdre Osman had sat in a room with a staff sergeant who told her she'd overstated it and gone back to her barracks and lived with that for 6 weeks, and had almost not called the inquiry line tonight because she couldn't calculate whether the truth was worth the cost. Those two things could not both be fully honored at the same time. She had made her choice about which one took priority. She was comfortable with that choice. What she was less comfortable with was how many people were about to push back on it, and from how many directions, and with how many different kinds of leverage. She found out the next morning. Garland's interview was scheduled for 07. At 06:53, Hollis, his JAG representative, called Mendes to inform her that his client would not be participating in the interview pending the outcome of a formal objection to the inquiry's scope that he was filing with the Judge Advocate General's office within the hour. Evelyn was in the conference room when Mendes walked in and told her. She absorbed it without expression. He's filing a scope objection. He's arguing the inquiry exceeds the Admiral's authority to convene, that fleet-level command has no jurisdiction over base-level personnel conduct absent a formal referral from the base commander. Who is the base commander? Captain Reeves. Who has not referred anything, Evelyn said. Correct. She thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. Get me Reeves. Captain Alan Reeves commanded Naval Station Halcyon. He was 53 years old, competent in the methodical way of officers who had risen through administration rather than operations. And he had been, as far as Evelyn could determine from the evidence in front of her, either uninformed about the prior Garland incidents or choosing not to be. She had not yet determined which. Both had consequences, but they were different ones. He was in her office at 0800, which told her he'd been anticipating the call. He was a tall man with a careful handshake and the expression of someone who had already worked out several versions of this conversation on the drive over. He sat across from her desk with his cover in his lap and his posture correct and waited for her to begin. Captain Reeves, she said, walk me through your understanding of the Osman complaint. He was quiet for a moment. Not long. I was informed by Staff Sergeant Garland in October that a personnel conflict between junior team members had been resolved at the supervisory level. I reviewed the summary he provided. I accepted his determination. You reviewed a summary? Yes, Admiral. Not the original complaint. A slight pause. The summary indicated the matter had been resolved. The matter had not been resolved, Evelyn said. The complaint had been reclassified. Those are different things, and I think you know that. Reeves was very still. I relied on the reporting I received. I understand that. What I'm asking you to tell me is whether you believe that reporting was complete. She leaned forward slightly. Because in my experience, Captain, when a commander accepts a summary without requesting the underlying documentation, it is sometimes because they trust their subordinate's judgment entirely, and sometimes because they prefer not to know what the documentation contains. The silence that followed was the kind that had a shape to it. Reeves looked at the cover in his lap. He looked at it for long enough that it became significant. I should have asked for the original report, he said. Yes, Evelyn said. You should have. She gave him the space to sit in that for a moment before she continued. I'm not here to determine whether your failure was negligence or avoidance. That's for the inquiry to establish. What I need from you right now is a formal referral. You have the authority. Garland's JAG rep is claiming I lack, so I need you to refer this matter. He looked up. And if I do? Then the inquiry proceeds on solid procedural ground and Garland's scope objection fails. And if I don't? Then I will spend the next 72 hours establishing an alternative, and the process will take longer, and in the meantime, the video that is currently at 3.4 million views will continue to generate questions that no one is answering in any official capacity, and the story people are building in the absence of official answers will be considerably less accurate and considerably less kind to this institution than what the actual facts would support. She said all of this without raising her voice. That's not a threat, Captain. That's an analysis. Reeves put his cover on the table. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had arrived at a decision he'd been avoiding and found it wasn't as complicated as he'd made it. I'll have the referral on your desk by 1000, he said. It was on her desk at 9:47. Garland's JAG objection failed at 11:15. Mendes called with the news in the same flat, precise tone she used for everything, which Evelyn had come to read as a sign of genuine satisfaction. The interview was rescheduled for 1400. She didn't attend it herself. That was Okafor's territory, and she trusted him in it. She spent the 2 hours reviewing the inquiry's documentation structure with Mendes and taking a call from the Public Affairs Office, which she kept to 11 minutes by the simple method of saying what she was willing to say and nothing additional. What she was willing to say was this: a formal inquiry was underway. It would be conducted according to full due process, and any conclusions about individuals or institutional practices would be reserved until that process was complete. She would not be characterizing the events at the Rusty Anchor as symbolic of anything, because she did not think a single event should be made to carry the weight of a systemic analysis while people were still determining the facts. She was aware the video was circulating. She had no comment on the video. She asked that Lance Corporal Osmond's identity be protected in any coverage, and she said this not as a suggestion, but as a clear expectation. The public affairs officer noted all of this with the slightly strained patience of someone who had hoped for more and understood they weren't going to get it. At 14:20, Okafor called her. Garland talked, he said. She waited. He's claiming he classified the Osmond report on the advice of someone above him, not Reeves. Above Reeves. Evelyn's hand tightened slightly on the phone. Did he name the person? He named a name, yes. He's willing to put it in writing in exchange for consideration on the witness tampering charge. What name? Okafor said it. She recognized it immediately. Everyone in the Pacific Fleet would have recognized it. It was the name of a man who had been in her professional orbit for 11 years, who had attended the same briefings and the same formal dinners and the same promotion ceremonies, who had shaken her hand in the corridors of buildings she'd worked in for 2 decades. It was the name of Rear Admiral Preston Vaughan. She sat very still with the phone against her ear while the harbor outside her window did what it always did, moved indifferently in the afternoon light. And she thought about what this meant. Not about Vaughan specifically, not yet, but about what it meant structurally. That the line she'd been pulling on had not ended with Garland, had not ended with Reeves, had gone further up into the machinery than a bar incident and a buried complaint had any right to reach. Is Garland's account corroborated by anything? She asked. He says there are emails. He says he kept them. Why would he keep them? He said, and I'm quoting here, because I've seen how this place works and I wanted something to hold on to. She thought about that. A man who had done genuinely bad things to a young Lance Corporal, who had buried her complaint at someone else's direction, who had kept the emails as insurance because he understood enough about institutional self-preservation to know he might need them. He was not a sympathetic figure. He had still called Osmond twice. He had still looked at a 21-year-old woman and told her she'd overstated it. None of that changed. The emails didn't rehabilitate him. But they were evidence, and evidence was what the inquiry needed to go where the evidence led. Tell him we'll consider the request in exchange for full cooperation and complete production of the documents, she said. No selective disclosure. Everything. Understood. And Marcus. She paused. Okafor's first name was Jerome. She had called him Marcus. She caught it immediately. I'm sorry. Jerome. I want this sequenced carefully. If Vaughan's name is in those emails, the inquiry expands again, and I need the procedural foundation to be airtight before we take that step. Every piece of paper, every authorization, every date and time. Nothing informal. Yes, Admiral. She ended the call. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window. The harbor was broad and flat and going gold in the late afternoon. A frigate was moving out through the channel on scheduled departure, its wake spreading behind it in two clean lines that would eventually disappear into the wider water. Preston Vaughn. She turned the name over carefully, the way you turned over something you'd picked up off the ground and weren't yet sure whether to keep. She thought about his handshakes, his briefings, his particular habit of listening in meetings with an expression of engaged consideration that she now wondered had been performance. She thought about Deirdre Osmond's faded bruise and the 6 weeks she'd spent carrying a complaint that had been quietly buried with, apparently, the involvement of a flag officer who had calculated that keeping it buried was in his interest. She thought about Drummond's call. There are people above both of us who would prefer this to be handled in a way that… Had he known? She couldn't answer that yet. Drummond was careful and political and deeply invested in the machinery of the institution, but that didn't make him complicit in what Garland was describing. It might make him aware of it. It might make him one of the people who'd decided the cost of addressing it was higher than the cost of not. She didn't know. She needed to know. She picked up her phone. She called Prentice. I need everything we have on Rear Admiral Vaughn's prior contact with the Halcyon Base Command. Personnel interactions, correspondence, anything that went through official channels in the last 14 months. Prentice didn't ask why. She said, I'll start pulling it now. And I need the secure line set up for a call to the JAG General's office. Tonight, if possible. How soon do you need it? Before Drummond calls me again. She said it without planning to. It came out of the place where certainty lived, beneath the level of deliberate speech, and once it was out, she recognized it as accurate. Drummond would call again. Whatever he'd been protecting her from, or warning her about, or positioning himself around, it had just gotten significantly more complicated, and he would know that as soon as Vaughn knew the inquiry had expanded, and Vaughn would know that faster than she'd like. The secure line was ready at 1740. She was still on it at 1920 when Prentice appeared in the doorway for the second time in 2 days with a folder and an expression that carried the same specific weight as the night before. Something that could not be softened and was not going to be. Evelyn held up a finger. She finished the sentence she was in the middle of with the JAG General's deputy and ended the call. What is it? She said. Prentice opened the folder. The emails Garland referenced. His JAG rep just transmitted them as a show of good faith while the cooperation agreement is being drafted. She set the folder on the desk. There are 11 of them. The last one was sent 4 days ago. 4 days ago. After the video. After the bar. After the inquiry had already been opened. Vaughan contacted Garland after the inquiry started, Evelyn said. Yes, Admiral. And there's something else. Prentice pointed to the second flagged page. The last email references a third party. Someone Vaughn says he's been in contact with about managing the situation. He doesn't use a name. He uses a title. Evelyn looked at the flagged line. The title was Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Personnel. The room was very quiet. The harbor outside was dark now, the lights across the water small and distant, and Evelyn Carter stood in her office and looked at the words on the page and understood, with the particular cold clarity of someone who has just seen the full shape of a thing. They were only seeing the edge of before, that this was no longer an inquiry into a staff sergeant and a corporal and a dockside bar. This had been a coordinated effort to bury what happened to Deirdre Osmond. And Marcus Drummond had called her at 7 in the morning to warn her, or to manage her, and she still did not know which one it had been, and that distinction had just become the most important question she was facing. Her phone lit up on the desk. The caller ID read, Drummond, M. She let it ring. Not out of avoidance, she had stopped avoiding difficult conversations somewhere around 2009, when she'd learned that the cost of delay was almost always higher than the cost of the conversation itself. She let it ring because she needed 10 seconds to decide exactly who she was going to be when she picked up, what she was going to say, and what she was going to withhold, and whether she was going to let Drummond know that she'd seen the email or hold that until she understood more precisely what his role in this actually was. The email said Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Personnel. That was Drummond's title. It did not say Drummond's name. It said someone Vaughn claimed to be in contact with. Those were not the same thing, and she needed to remember that they were not the same thing, because the difference between a title and a name was the difference between evidence and inference, and she had built 26 years on not confusing those two. She picked up on the fifth ring. "Marcus," she said. "Evelyn." His voice was different from the morning call. The measured resonance was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, a tightness, a quality of controlled urgency. "I need to tell you something. All right? I need to tell you in person, tonight." She looked at the folder on her desk. She looked at Prentice, who was still standing in the doorway, reading her expression with the attentiveness of someone who had been doing exactly that for 3 years and had gotten very good at it. "Where are you?" Evelyn asked. "I landed at Pearl 40 minutes ago. I'm at the Halcyon Gate." She hadn't known he was coming. That meant either he'd decided to come after the inquiry expanded this afternoon, fast, but possible, or he'd been in transit before the expansion, which meant he'd been moving toward her before Garland's emails surfaced. She didn't know which. Both had implications she wasn't ready to map yet. "I'll have someone meet you at the gate," she said. 20 minutes. She hung up and looked at Prentice. "Get Okafor. Tell him to be in the small conference room in 15 minutes. Tell him why." She picked up the folder. "And call Mendes. I want her on standby." Prentice was already moving. Drummond arrived looking like a man who had been on a plane for 5 hours and had not slept on it. His uniform was correct. He was always correctly uniformed. It was one of the things she'd noted about him over the years, the way his presentation never slipped regardless of circumstance. But there was something around his eyes and in the set of his jaw that didn't match the presentation. He sat down across from her in the small conference room with Okafor at the table's end, and he put both hands flat on the surface and he looked at her and said, "How far have you gotten?" "Tell me what you know first," she said. "Evelyn, Marcus, I need to hear your account before I tell you what I have. That's not a negotiation. That's how this has to work." He looked at Okafor, then back at her. He made the calculation she could see him making, what it meant that Okafor was in the room, what it meant that she was asking him to go first, what the shape of the evening suggested about how much she already knew. "Preston Vaughn called me 6 weeks ago," he said, "right around the time the Osmond complaint was filed. He told me there had been a conduct complaint at Halcyon, that Garland had reviewed and resolved, and that there might be some noise about it from the junior member involved. He said he wanted to make sure it didn't develop into something that pulled fleet-level attention during a period when the command was already dealing with deployment pressures." "And what did you say?" "I told him that complaints resolved at the supervisory level were a base command matter and fleet personnel had no role in managing them." He held her gaze. "I did not tell him to bury anything. I did not authorize any action. I told him it wasn't my jurisdiction and ended the call. Did you follow up?" "No." "Did you flag the call to anyone?" A pause. Shorter than a second, but she caught it. "No." "Why not?" "Because I took him at his word that the matter had been properly resolved. Because I had no reason at the time to believe otherwise." He looked at the table for a moment. "That was a mistake. I've known it was a mistake since your name came up in connection with the bar video, and I pulled the Halcyon file and understood what I'd been told wasn't the complete picture." "What did you find when you pulled the file?" "Enough to know that Vaughn had a reason to want that complaint quiet that had nothing to do with deployment pressures." He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded document. He placed it on the table between them. "This is a summary of a IG referral I drafted this morning, before I flew out. I have not submitted it yet because I wanted to speak with you first." Evelyn looked at the document without touching it. "An Inspector General referral. For Vaughn, based on what I found in the Halcyon file and what I believe his motivation was for calling me." He exhaled. "Preston Vaughn and Deirdre Osmond's direct supervisor, not Garland, the one above Garland, a lieutenant commander named Taft, served together in Yokosuka 7 years ago. There are conduct complaints from that posting that were also resolved at the supervisory level. Same pattern, different personnel." The room was quiet. "Vaughn wasn't protecting Garland," Evelyn said. "He was protecting Taft. And through Taft himself. Because if Taft's pattern went to formal review, the Yokosuka incidents come back into the light, and Vaughn is the officer who signed off on their resolution." Okafor had stopped writing. He was very still. Evelyn looked at the IG referral. She thought about the email in Garland's file, the one that used Drummond's title, not his name, the one that had made her spend 10 seconds deciding who to be before she picked up the phone. She thought about whether Drummond had come here tonight because he was covering himself, or because he was trying to do the right thing late, which was still doing the right thing, even if the timing was imperfect and the motivation was complicated. People were almost never purely one thing. She had learned that too. If you submit that referral, she said, it intersects with my inquiry. We'll need to coordinate the jurisdictional boundary. I know. Mendes will need to be part of that conversation. I expected that. And you'll need to provide a formal statement about Vaughn's call to you, on the record, including the fact that you didn't flag it at the time. He didn't flinch. Yes. That statement will be part of the inquiry record. It will be visible to anyone with access to the final report. I understand what I'm agreeing to, Evelyn. She picked up the IG referral. She read the summary. It was clean, precise, legally framed, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had spent the flight from the mainland doing it carefully. Whatever Drummond was, he was not sloppy. And whatever his motivation, the document in her hands moved the inquiry in the direction it needed to go. All right, she said. I'll have Mendes contact your office first thing tomorrow to coordinate the scope. He nodded. Then he looked at her with the expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not managed, not calculated. Something closer to the face people had when they'd been carrying something and had just set it down and weren't yet sure how to stand without the weight. The bar footage, he said. When I saw it, before I pulled the file, before I knew any of this, I thought it was going to be a PR problem that needed management. He paused. I was wrong about what it was. Yes, she said. You were. She did not soften it. That wasn't unkindness. It was the same honesty she'd extended to Reeves, the same honesty she tried to extend to everyone when the stakes were high enough that softening served no one. He had been wrong. He had also, ultimately, gotten on a plane. Both things were true, and both things mattered. Drummond left at 2100. Okafor stayed another 30 minutes going through the coordination framework with her, mapping where the IG referral and the inquiry overlapped and where they needed to stay separate. Mendes joined by phone for the last 15 minutes. By the time Evelyn walked out of the conference room, the base had the particular quiet of a place that never fully sleeps but has downshifted into its overnight frequency. Reduced foot traffic, lower voices, the distant sound of a security vehicle making its rounds. She went back to her office and sat at her desk and did not do anything for approximately 4 minutes. This was not nothing. This was the specific practice she'd developed over years of high-pressure, sustained work. The deliberate pause, the full stop, the acknowledgement that the body and the mind needed occasional permission to not be in motion. 4 minutes. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting the coordination memo to JAG. She worked until midnight. The next 72 hours moved with the grinding, unglamorous momentum of institutional machinery doing what it was designed to do when properly engaged. Statements were taken. Documents were reviewed. The coordination between Evelyn's inquiry and Drummond's IG referral was mapped by Mendes and Drummond's own legal staff with a precision that required 3 separate calls to resolve a single jurisdictional question about which process took precedence on the Taft-related conduct history. The answer ultimately was that they ran parallel with agreed information sharing, a solution that satisfied no one entirely and was therefore probably correct. Vaughn was notified of the IG referral on the second day. He was in San Diego. His response, transmitted through his legal representative, was a formal statement asserting that his contact with Garland had been advisory in nature and within the scope of his routine liaison function with base commands. He did not address the Yokosuka incidents. He did not address the email Garland had produced. His representative described these as documents requiring context that would be provided in due course. Due course was not going to be fast enough. Garland's cooperation agreement was finalized on the 3rd day. In exchange for full document production and testimony, the witness tampering charge would be considered alongside, but not eliminated from, his overall disposition, a distinction his JAG representative had argued against for 6 hours and ultimately accepted because the alternative was worse. He produced 43 emails over the course of that afternoon, 11 from Vaughn directly, 12 from Taft. The remaining 20 from a chain that included 3 other names, 2 of whom were currently serving in positions of significant authority. one of whom had been promoted 8 months ago to a command that put him 2 rungs below where Evelyn was standing. She read all 43. She read them in order, chronologically, the way you read something when you want to understand not just the content but the shape of it, how it had built, what each message added to the one before, where the decision to act had been made, and who had made it. The picture that emerged was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something more common and in some ways more troubling. A network of men who had protected each other across postings and years, who had learned that the mechanism for doing so was not overt coordination but shared understanding, the kind that didn't require explicit instruction because everyone involved already knew what was needed and what it cost to refuse. They had not gathered in a room and decided to bury Deirdre Osmond's complaint. They had each, individually, made the calculation that surfacing it was not in their interest, and the accumulated weight of those individual calculations had produced the same outcome as a coordinated effort would have. That was the part she was going to have difficulty explaining in a way that didn't sound like she was making excuses for any of them. Because she wasn't. The fact that a harm was produced by a system rather than a single decision did not make the harm less real or the individuals less responsible. It just made the accounting more complex. She said some version of this to Okafor on the third evening, when they were the last 2 people in the conference room, and the coffee had gone cold and neither of them had eaten since early afternoon. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued about him. "The report is going to have to address the systemic dimension," he said when she finished. "Yes. That makes it significantly more politically exposed." "I know." She looked at the stacked folders on the table. "Do it anyway." On the 4th day, 2 things happened in the same afternoon. The first was that Lieutenant Commander Taft, apparently informed by his legal counsel of the scope of what had been produced in the cooperation agreement, requested a voluntary interview. His representative indicated he wished to provide context for certain communications. Mendes called this development, in her professionally neutral way, significant. What she meant, and what Evelyn understood, was that Taft was calculating that cooperating now was better than being compelled later, which meant he believed the evidence against him was sufficient to compel him, which was its own form of confirmation. The second thing that happened was that the story broke publicly. Not the video. The video had been circulating for 4 days and had accumulated, by Prentice's last count, somewhere north of 6 million views across platforms. What broke was a piece by a senior correspondent at a national outlet, sourced to 3 individuals described as familiar with the inquiry, that outlined the existence of the investigation into Vaughn and Taft and named the pattern of buried complaints going back to Yokosuka. The piece was careful. It named no victims. It used language like alleged and under review throughout. But it was detailed enough that anyone with knowledge of the relevant personnel could map the geography of what it was describing. Evelyn read it in her office at 1400 and then sat for a moment thinking about her 3 anonymous sources. She didn't know who they were. She had her suspicions. The level of detail suggested someone with inquiry access. But the framing suggested someone who understood the institutional politics from the outside looking in, which pointed toward a different category of person. And she had already asked Mendes and Okafor whether there was a leak problem they needed to address. Okafor's answer had been careful. "Admiral, the story doesn't contain anything that compromises the inquiry's integrity or puts any witness at risk. What it contains is accurate information about the existence and scope of the investigation. I'm not in a position to endorse the leak, but I'm also not sure the leak is our most pressing problem right now." He was right. It wasn't. Her most pressing problem arrived at 1600 in the form of a call from the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral Constance Yardley was 64 years old and had been CNO for 2 years. She was the 3rd woman to hold the position and conducted herself with the particular absence of drama of someone who had decided long ago that her existence in the role was not the point. The work was the point. Evelyn had known her for 15 years and respected her in the uncomplicated way you respected someone whose judgment had been consistently sound across a long period of genuinely difficult situations. She picked up immediately. "Connie," she said. "Evelyn." Yardley's voice was steady and direct, the same voice she used in briefings and in private, and Evelyn suspected everywhere else. "I've been read into the inquiry scope, Drummond's IG referral, and your investigation. I want to ask you 2 questions." "Go ahead." "First, are you confident in the evidentiary foundation? Not the legal team's confidence, yours. Yes, Evelyn said. The documents are real. The pattern is real. The people named in the cooperation agreement are the people who should be named. Second, is there anything in what you've found that should have come to me sooner than it did? Evelyn thought about this honestly. The Osmond complaint should have come to you when it was first filed. It didn't because of decisions made by people below both of us. Everything that's happened since the bar has moved as fast as it responsibly could. That's a fair answer. A brief pause. I want to tell you that I'm going to make a call this afternoon to Preston Vaughan's office to inform him of the CNO's direct involvement in the review. Yes, and to make clear that any further contact with inquiry witnesses or subjects, direct or indirect, will be treated as obstruction and handled accordingly. Another pause. He should have understood that already. Apparently he needs to hear it from this office. Thank you, Connie. Don't thank me. This is not a favor. This is the institution working the way it's supposed to work when people do their jobs. The directness in her voice shifted, slightly, towards something that might have been personal. The video. 6 million people. I'm aware. You handled the public dimension correctly. No statement, no characterization, no feeding the narrative before the facts were established. I want you to know that was noted. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. Yardley meant it as acknowledgement. She understood that. But something about it sat slightly wrong. The idea that her restraint was notable, that not exploiting a moment of public visibility for personal positioning deserved comment, because it suggested that the expectation was low enough that doing the obvious correct thing required recognition. She let it go. I appreciate that. After the call, she stood at the window for a long time. The harbor was doing what it always did. The water moved. The light changed. Somewhere out past the channel, the strike group was back on station. The typhoon track dissipated. The ships running their regular operations as if the last 4 days had not happened, because for them, operationally, they hadn't. Vaughan's formal interview request came the next morning. He'd reversed course overnight, apparently after Yardley's call, and his representative now indicated that his client wished to make a full voluntary statement and answer all questions from the inquiry team. The tone of the communication was notably different from the due course language of 4 days ago. More urgent, less assured, the specific cadence of someone who had looked at what was arrayed against them and recalculated. Evelyn did not conduct the interview herself. That was by design. Okafor and Mendes ran it, with a JAG recorder present, and she stayed out of the room deliberately because she understood that her presence would make it about something other than the evidence. It needed to be about the evidence. She read the transcript that evening. Vaughan had been, in the end, cooperative in the technical sense. He answered questions. He did not take the fifth on anything material. He confirmed the substance of the emails and acknowledged his contact with Garland. But he had also, consistently and with the specific texture of a man who had rehearsed the framing carefully, described his actions as motivated by legitimate institutional concern rather than personal protection. He used the word judgment 11 times. He used the phrase reasonable interpretation 8 times. He positioned every decision as a considered exercise of discretionary authority rather than the calculated suppression of a credible complaint. He was wrong. The document said he was wrong. But he wasn't stupid, and his framing would give his defense something to work with, and Evelyn knew that the distance between what was true and what could be proven to a formal standard was a real distance that the inquiry had to bridge carefully. Taft's voluntary statement came the following morning. It was shorter and considerably less polished than Vaughan's, which told her that Taft had made the decision to cooperate more recently and with less preparation. He confirmed the Yokosuka conduct history. He confirmed that Vaughan had advised him on how to manage complaints through supervisory resolution rather than formal process. He used the word protect in a way that he clearly meant to convey institutional continuity, and that read, on the page, as something considerably less defensible. Mendes called it the most useful 4 pages of the week, and Evelyn agreed. On the 7th day after the Rusty Anchor, she wrote the executive summary of the inquiry's initial findings. She wrote it herself. Not because she didn't trust Mendes or Okafor to draft it, but because some documents needed to carry the weight of direct authorship, and this was one of them. She wrote it over 6 hours, going back through it 3 times, testing every phrase for precision and every conclusion for the adequacy of its evidentiary support. The findings were clear. Garland had suppressed a credible conduct complaint against a subordinate. Taft had directed him to do so. Vaughn had protected Taft's ability to do so by ensuring the complaint remained below the threshold of fleet-level review. The mechanism they had used was not overt instruction, but institutional pressure applied through informal channels, calls, emails, the quiet exercise of positional authority in ways that didn't show up on any official record until Garland kept the emails. Deirdre Osman had been right. She had not overstated it. She had described accurately what had happened to her and been told by the machinery she'd trusted to protect her that she was wrong. And she had carried that for 6 weeks, and she had nearly not called the inquiry line. She wrote that in the summary. Not as a legal conclusion, as a fact. It was a fact, and it belonged in the record, and she was not going to manage it into something softer in the interest of institutional comfort. She submitted the executive summary to Yardley's office at 2200. At 2247, her secure phone rang. She recognized the number as Yardley's personal line. "I've read it," Yardley said. "All right. I'm issuing a formal directive tomorrow morning. Vaughn is being placed on administrative hold pending the IG process. Taft is being referred to a formal board of inquiry. Garland's cooperation agreement allows for reduced disposition but not dismissal. He's going to answer for what he did to Osman, regardless of what he provided." Good. The 2 names from the email chain, the ones currently serving. Yes. Their commands are being notified tonight that they're under review, quietly, until the IG process establishes what their actual exposure is. A pause. "I want to be transparent with you about one thing, Evelyn. There will be people who argue that the systemic framing in your summary overstates the case, that you've taken individual failures and constructed a narrative of institutional complicity that isn't fully supported. I know they'll argue that. What will you say?" "I'll say that the emails are real, and the pattern is real, and the argument that parallel individual failures produced identical outcomes by coincidence is an argument that protects the system at the expense of the people the system harmed." She kept her voice even. "And I'll say it as many times as I need to." Yardley was quiet for a moment. "All right, one more thing." Her voice shifted the way Drummond's had, into something less official, though in Yardley's case it landed differently. Less like the relaxation of management and more like the weight of someone saying exactly what they meant. "Ryan Mercer." Evelyn waited. "His formal disciplinary hearing is scheduled for next week, standard process from here. But I understand you have a perspective on disposition." "I do." "Tell me." "He's 23 years old. He did something genuinely wrong and he needs to answer for it formally. But the answer shouldn't be the end of his career. What he needs is someone to hold him to a standard he hasn't been held to before and give him long enough to actually meet it." She paused. "Put him somewhere where that can happen, under someone who knows the difference between punishment and accountability." "Do you have a recommendation for the assignment?" Evelyn looked at the harbor. Dark water. Distant lights. "I'll make a call," she said. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. 7 days. From a bar stool and a club soda and a corporal who thought she was nothing to 43 emails, and an admiral on administrative hold and a CNO directive going out in the morning. The line between those 2 points was not straight and it was not clean, and several of the decisions along it had been harder than they looked, and at least 2 of them she was not completely sure she'd gotten right. She was thinking about which 2 when her laptop chimed with an incoming message. She looked at the sender. It was Prentice, which was unusual at this hour, and the subject line read only, "You need to see this." She opened it. It was a forwarded email chain. The originating address was an account she didn't recognize, routed through a personal server, not an official military address. The chain had been sent to 3 recipients: a journalist at the outlet that had broken the story 4 days ago, a senior congressional staffer on the Armed Services Committee, and an address that belonged to the Office of the Naval Inspector General. The email contained a document, 22 pages. Detailed, sourced, organized with the kind of structural precision that came from someone who understood both the institutional machinery and the legal thresholds required to make something stick. It was not about Vaughn. It was not about Taft. It was not about Garland. It was about Evelyn Carter, and it alleged, with specificity that made her go very still, that her handling of the inquiry had been designed not to surface institutional misconduct, but to eliminate professional rivals. that the expansion of scope had been a deliberate strategy to target officers who had opposed her fleet command priorities over the previous 18 months, and that the Osman complaint was being used as cover for what was, in effect, a coordinated effort to reshape the senior leadership of Pacific Fleet in her favor. She read all 22 pages. Then she sat back in her chair and understood, with absolute clarity, that someone had spent the last 7 days watching her build a case and had simultaneously been building one against her, and they had released it tonight, while Yardley's directive was being drafted, while the inquiry was at its most exposed and most consequential, because they had calculated that the timing was exactly right to do the maximum possible damage. She did not know yet who had sent it, but 3 of the officers named in her inquiry's email chain had the institutional access, the motivation, and the specific knowledge of her professional history that the document contained and the account it had come from had been created 11 days ago, 4 days before she ever walked into the Rusty Anchor. She read it a second time, not because she'd missed anything the first time, but because the second read was where you found the architecture, the choices about what to include and what to omit, the way the framing leaned, where the language was precise, and where it went slightly soft in the way of someone hedging around the parts they couldn't fully support. The document was sophisticated. It wasn't the work of someone who'd made this decision in the last 7 days. Parts of it had been assembled over months. She could see that in the specificity of certain citations, meeting dates, internal correspondence references, the kind of granular detail that required sustained access and sustained intent. Someone had been building this for a long time. She closed the laptop. She sat in the dark of her office for 4 minutes. The same 4 she always allowed herself, no more. And then she opened it again and called Prentice. "Who else has seen this?" "Just me, Admiral. I forwarded it to you immediately." "How did you get it?" "It came to the General Inquiry inbox. Same account that sent it to the journalist and the congressional staffer. Whoever sent it wanted us to see it too." That was the piece that mattered. The sender had copied the inquiry's own inbox, which meant they wanted Evelyn to know it was out there, wanted her to spend tonight afraid of what was coming rather than focused on what she'd already built. It was a pressure tactic, not just an attack. The document was designed to do 2 things simultaneously: damage her externally and destabilize her internally. She thought about who had the motivation to do both. "Get me Mendes," she said. "Tonight. I know what time it is. Tonight." Mendes arrived at 23:40 still in civilian clothes, which meant she'd been home, which meant she'd left something to come back. She sat across from Evelyn, read the document on Evelyn's laptop, and was quiet for approximately 90 seconds. "The email account was created 11 days ago," Evelyn said. "Before the bar." "Yes. Which means whoever drafted this had a trigger point in mind that wasn't you specifically, or they were prepared for multiple scenarios and this one fit. Or they knew something was going to happen that would give them the opportunity to use it." Mendes looked at her. "You think someone knew about the inquiry before it opened?" "I think the document contains details about my professional history that required either a sustained surveillance effort or access to my personnel record. And I think it was released tonight, specifically tonight, while the CNO's directive is being drafted and the inquiry is at maximum institutional exposure because someone timed it that way." "That's a serious allegation." "I'm not making it as an allegation yet. I'm making it as an analytical observation that needs to be tested." Evelyn turned the laptop toward her. "The 3 officers named in the email chain who have the relevant access and motivation, Vawan, and the 2 names from the secondary chain. One of them is in San Diego. One of them is currently at a posting in Yokosuka. The third is here at Pearl." "Commander Darrell Finch," Mendes said, reading from her memory of the inquiry files. "Currently assigned as Deputy Fleet Operations Officer. He was also, 7 years ago, stationed in Yokosuka at the same time as Taft and Vaughn." "I know." "And he was promoted 8 months ago by a board on which Preston Vaughn served as a reviewing officer." Mendes set the laptop down. She looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone who was doing careful math and not liking the sum. If Finch created the account 11 days ago, there would be digital forensics that could establish it. IP logs, account creation data, metadata on the document itself. "Can we get that tonight?" "I know someone at the Naval Criminal Investigative Service who owes me a significant professional favor." Mendes was already reaching for her phone. "Give me 20 minutes." It took 35. The NCIS contact, an agent named Burris, who apparently answered his personal phone at midnight without complaint, which suggested the favor was very significant indeed, confirmed that the account metadata could be pulled within hours. He also confirmed, before they ended the call, that the document file itself contained embedded authorship data that had not been scrubbed, an oversight that suggested either arrogance or haste, or both. The authorship field showed a name. The name was not Daryl Finch, it was not Vaughn or Taft, or anyone whose name had appeared in any document Evelyn had reviewed over the last 7 days. It was a name she looked at twice before she recognized it, and when she did, the recognition came with the specific cold quality of something that reorients the entire map. Lieutenant Commander Patrick Swell, Finch's aide. 31 years old, assigned to the Deputy Fleet Operations Office for 14 months, possessing by virtue of his role exactly the access to scheduling records, internal correspondence, and personnel files that the document required. Not the principal, the instrument. Finch drafted this using Swell's access, Mendes said, or Swell drafted it on Finch's direction and didn't clean the metadata. Either way, we have the thread. Yes. Evelyn looked at the time, nearly 1 a.m. In 4 hours, Yardley's directive goes out. I need this in front of her before it does. Yardley answered the call herself. Evelyn laid it out in 8 minutes. The document, the inbox copy, the metadata, the Swell connection, the Finch analysis. She did not speculate beyond what the evidence supported. She presented it the same way she presented everything, sequentially, clearly, with the conclusions labeled as conclusions and the inferences labeled as inferences. When she finished, Yardley was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've had approximately 3 hours of sleep in the last 2 days. I'm aware of that. And you're still doing this with your head clear. I'll sleep when the directive is out." "All right." Yardley's voice tightened into the register of decision. "NCIS will have authorization to proceed on Swell and Finch as of this call. I'll document it as an emergency authorization, and the formal paperwork will follow at 0600. A pause. "The directive still goes out this morning. Vaughn's administrative hold, Taft's board referral, all of it. We don't delay because someone tried to preempt us." "No," Evelyn said. "We don't." "Get some sleep, Evelyn." She didn't sleep. She sat at her desk and watched the harbor go from black to the dark blue that preceded dawn, and she thought about the shape of the last 8 days and the shape of the next ones. And she thought about Deirdre Osman and the call she'd almost not made. And she thought about Ryan Mercer standing at attention in the rusty anchor with his beer hanging from his hand. And she thought about the 43 emails and 22 pages and the particular human capacity for elaborate self-protection, the lengths people went to when they were afraid of being seen clearly. At 5:40, she made coffee. At 6:10, Prentice arrived, and they went through the morning brief without either of them acknowledging how strange the last 8 days had been, because that was how you got through it. By treating the extraordinary with the same procedural respect you gave the ordinary, by not making the weight of it into a story until after it was over. At 6:58, the CNO's directive went out across Pacific Fleet Command. Evelyn read it in her office. It was precise and unequivocal. Yardley's signature was on it, and Yardley didn't draft unequivocal things loosely. Rear Admiral Preston Vaughn placed on administrative hold, all command functions suspended pending IG review. Lieutenant Commander Taft referred to a formal board of inquiry. Garland's cooperation agreement formalized. The 2 secondary chain officers notified of their review status through their respective commands. A systemic review of supervisory resolution practices across Pacific Fleet Base commands ordered, to be completed within 90 days and reported directly to the CNO's office. At 7:20, NCIS executed search warrants on Daryl Finch's office and quarters. Evelyn learned about it from Burris via Mendes. She was not present, had not been asked to be, and had been deliberately kept outside the operational circle for exactly the reasons that mattered in these situations. Finch did not resist. He was, by Burris's account, unsurprised. The expression of a man who had known the moment would come and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. Swell was interviewed separately at 8:15. He cooperated immediately and completely, which Burris described as the response of someone who had understood what he'd been asked to participate in, but had not understood until now that participation carried the same consequences as origination. She didn't read the full interview transcripts until the afternoon. When she did, the picture that assembled was exactly what she'd suspected. Finch had been in contact with Vaughn's legal representative within hours of the inquiry's expansion, had understood that the evidentiary position was serious, and had made the calculation that a preemptive offensive, casting Evelyn's inquiry as self-serving, might create enough institutional ambiguity to slow the process or soften the outcomes. He had used Swell's access to pull the personnel file details. He had drafted the document himself. He had not told Swell what it was going to be used for, which was either strategic or simply cowardly, and in her experience, those two things were often the same. The document was never published. The journalist who received it contacted the Public Affairs Office at 9:15 to note that she had received an unsolicited communication concerning the inquiry and wanted to flag it before proceeding, which was either excellent journalism or the result of the calls the CNO's office had made to media relations the previous evening. Evelyn suspected the latter had helped the former. The Congressional Staffer's Office called at 10 and asked 3 questions that Mendes answered in writing by noon. By 1400, the story that existed publicly was the correct one. At 1500, she had the meeting she'd been putting off. Ryan Mercer was brought to her office, not the conference room, not a formal setting, her office, by Master Chief Whitaker, who had been part of this from the first night, and who Evelyn had asked to be present not as a witness, but because his presence meant something to her that she couldn't fully articulate and didn't need to. He stood near the window. Mercer sat across from her desk. He looked different from the bar. Not diminished exactly. That wasn't the right word. He looked smaller in the way people look smaller when the performance has gone out of them, when there's nothing left to manage and they're just sitting in whatever they actually are. He'd had 8 days to live with what he'd done. She didn't know exactly what those 8 days had looked like for him from the inside, but she could see the residue of them in the way he held himself. "Your formal disciplinary hearing is Monday," she said. "You already know the outcome. Reduction in rank, formal reprimand, mandatory completion of the Leadership Accountability Program." She paused. "That's the institutional answer. I want to give you a different one." He looked at her. He didn't speak. "You judged me before you knew anything about me. You made a decision about what I was worth based on what I looked like, and then you defended that decision physically because that's what your training had given you for situations where you felt challenged." She held his gaze. "That's not a character flaw. That's a pattern. Patterns come from somewhere. They can also go somewhere else. Admiral, I'm not finished. Not harsh, just clear. There's a staff sergeant in Pensacola named Reika Oduya. She runs the accountability leadership track at the training command. She's one of the best instructors in the fleet, and she is not easy. You'll spend 12 months under her direct supervision. You'll complete the full track, and then you'll stay on as a junior facilitator for another year. After that, your record gets reviewed again with fresh eyes." Mercer was very still. "Why are you doing that?" She thought about how to answer it honestly. "Because punishment is what we give people when we've given up on them," she said. "I haven't given up on you, but I want to be clear. What I'm offering isn't a favor. It's harder than what a formal board would hand down. Oduya will expect more from you than you've ever been expected to deliver, and if you fail it, the board is still waiting." He looked at his hands. Then he looked up. "I put my hands on you." "Yes." "I said things that, yes." She didn't walk him through it. He knew what he'd done. "The question is what you do with knowing it. That's the only question that matters from here." He nodded slowly. It wasn't a confident nod. It was the nod of someone who was accepting something they didn't feel ready for, which was exactly the right response, because readiness was what the next 2 years were supposed to build. "Yes, ma'am," he said. After Whitaker walked him out, she sat for a moment. She wasn't certain she'd made the right call. She was rarely certain of anything in the way that people who hadn't done this work imagined certainty. She thought it was the right call. She thought Oduya was the right person and the right structure, and that Mercer was, underneath the arrogance he'd been allowed to marinate in, someone who could be made into something worth making. She might be wrong. She had been wrong before about these calculations. The only thing she was sure of was that she was applying the same framework she applied to everything, what serves the actual outcome, not what feels satisfying in the moment. And she could stand behind that even if the result turned out imperfectly. Most results turned out imperfectly. That wasn't failure. That was just how things were. At 1700, she got a text from a number she'd saved under a single initial. It said, "Heard the directive went out." You okay? It was from Daniel Whitaker. She stared at the message for a moment. 2 words. You okay? And the fact that he'd asked them via text rather than in person told her he'd known she might need the option of a short answer. She typed back, "Ask me in a week." His response came in 30 seconds. Fair enough. She put the phone down and looked at the harbor. It was going gold again the way it went gold every evening, the same light it had been doing since long before any of them were here and would keep doing long after. The water didn't care about any of it. The water just moved. There was something in that she'd always found useful. Not comfort exactly, but perspective. The reminder that the significance of any given thing was proportional to the attention you gave it, and that you could choose sometimes how much attention was right. The piece ran the following morning. Not the false one, that had been quietly buried when Finch's authorization to distribute it evaporated along with his access and his freedom of movement. The piece that ran was 1,200 words by the same journalist who'd broken the inquiry story, sourced carefully, accurate in its essentials. It described the Osmond complaint, the suppression pattern, the Vaughan and Taft referrals, the systemic review Yardley had ordered. It mentioned Evelyn by name, in the context of the inquiry she'd opened and the executive summary she'd authored. It did not call her a hero. It called her, in the second-to-last paragraph, an officer who had done her job when doing it was inconvenient and let the facts carry the rest. She read it at her desk over bad coffee and thought that was probably the most accurate thing that had been written about the last 10 days. Deirdre Osmond requested a brief meeting at 1100. She came in alone this time, without Mendis, which was itself a form of information. She sat across from Evelyn's desk in the same chair Mercer had sat in the previous afternoon. But she held herself differently. Not relaxed, not entirely, but with less of the defended qualities she'd had in their first meeting. Something had shifted in her posture. Not resolution exactly. More like the physical adjustment that happens when a weight you've been bracing against has been removed and your body hasn't quite recalibrated yet. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." She met Evelyn's eyes directly. "I want to. There's a difference." Evelyn accepted that. "How are you doing? And I mean, actually, not the answer you give to the question." Osmond was quiet for a moment. "I'm angry," she said. "I thought I would feel better faster, but mostly I'm angry that it needed all of this." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the last 10 days with one hand. "My complaint was real the day I filed it. It didn't become real because you got shoved in a bar." "You're right," Evelyn said. "It didn't, and I want to be honest with you. I can't fix that. I can't go back and make your complaint get the response it deserved when you filed it. What I can do is make sure the system that failed you is documented and pressured and changed, and that the people who made the decision to fail you are answering for it." She paused. "That's not the same thing as what should have happened." "No," Osmond said. "It's not." Then quietly, "But it's something." "It's something," Evelyn agreed. Osmond left at 11:20. Evelyn looked at the chair she'd sat in and thought about the distance between what institutions were supposed to do and what they actually did, and the human cost of that distance, which was almost never evenly distributed. The people who paid the most for institutional failure were almost never the people with the most ability to absorb the cost. That was not a new observation. It wasn't even a complicated one. But it had a way of sitting differently when you'd watched a 21-year-old woman sit across a table and tell you she was angry that it took this long, and know she was completely, entirely right. The 90-day systemic review Yardley had ordered produced its report on the 68th day, submitted early because the reviewing team found more than expected and had the sense to move faster. It documented 17 instances across Pacific Fleet-based commands in which conduct complaints had been resolved at the supervisory level without adequate documentation of the underlying facts. 4 of those cases were referred for fresh review. 2 produced new findings. The review also produced a revised protocol for complaint handling that required independent documentation at every stage of supervisory resolution and mandated a secondary review by personnel outside the direct reporting chain. It was not a perfect protocol. Evelyn read it and found 3 places where the language was ambiguous in ways that could be exploited by someone motivated to exploit them. She noted those in a memo to Yardley's office and suggested specific revisions. 2 of 3 were incorporated. The third was a matter of ongoing discussion. Nothing was ever finished. That was something she'd accepted a long time ago. That the work didn't resolve, it continued, and the measure of it wasn't whether you reached a state of completion, but whether the direction was right. Vaughn's IG process concluded 4 months later. He was found to have improperly used his positional authority to suppress a credible conduct complaint, and to have done so in coordination with subordinate officers for the purpose of protecting a pattern of behavior that predated the Osman incident. He received a formal letter of censure, was reduced in rank to Rear Admiral lower half, and retired under the reduced grade 6 months after the finding. He issued a statement through his attorney that described the outcome as the result of a process he believed had been conducted unfairly. Taft's board of inquiry resulted in separation from service. He did not issue a statement. Garland received formal punishment under the Uniform Code, reduced in grade, and was reassigned to a non-supervisory role pending final review of his service record. His cooperation was noted. It did not erase what he had done. Those two things were both true. Finch was separated from service and referred to federal prosecutors for the unauthorized use of personnel records. Swell received a lesser disposition for full cooperation. Both outcomes were proportional to the decisions each man had made. Neither of them was satisfying in the clean, conclusive way that people who hadn't worked in these systems sometimes imagined justice was supposed to feel. Ryan Mercer reported to Pensacola on a Tuesday in March. Evelyn received a brief report from Oduya at the 30-day mark. He's harder to break than I expected. That's not a compliment yet. Ask me at 90 days. She read it twice and found it, against her better judgment, slightly encouraging. She did not tell anyone it was encouraging. She waited for 90 days. The 90-day report said, "He's listening now. That's where it starts." She kept that one. The rusty anchor did not become a landmark. The internet moved on the way it always moved on, and 6 million views became a reference point for people writing about military culture and gender and institutional accountability. And then it became a footnote, and then it became the kind of thing people had heard of without knowing precisely why. Walt kept the bar exactly as it was. He didn't put up a plaque. He didn't call anyone. He replaced the jukebox, finally, with a better one, and he kept a bottle of club soda in the dedicated spot at the near end of the bar, the one by the door. Evelyn came back once, about 4 months after. She sat in the same seat. She ordered a club soda. Walt refilled it without being asked. The baseball season was underway and the game was on, and nobody in the bar knew who she was or looked twice, and she was grateful for it in a way that she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't spent most of their career being looked at as a symbol of something rather than a person doing a job. She ate peanuts. She watched the game. She thought about Osman and Mercer and Drummond and Yardley and Taft and the 43 emails and the 5 million views and the bad coffee in the transit hotel and the night she ran a carrier group through a typhoon from a corner booth while someone told her she didn't belong there. She thought about what it had taken to get here, not the rank. She'd stopped thinking of the rank as the point somewhere around the 15th year. What it had taken was something harder to name, the sustained willingness to be in the room where the decision got made and then actually make it, the resistance to the institutional gravity that pulled everything toward the easier path, the ability to hold two contradictory truths simultaneously, that the system had failed and that the system was worth fighting to fix, without resolving them into something simpler than they were. She was not a clean story. She had not won cleanly. She had made calls she was uncertain about and taken action she couldn't fully defend in retrospect, and navigated 11 days of sustained institutional pressure without always knowing, in real time, whether she was getting it right. She had been tired and occasionally wrong, and at least once had called Okafor by the wrong name in a moment of exhaustion. She had sat in a bar wanting to be nobody for a couple of hours, and instead become, briefly, the most visible person in a very complicated room. She drank her club soda. The visitors were down by 1 in the 7th. This was the thing nobody told you about the long work of trying to make things more right than they were. It didn't resolve into peace. It didn't culminate in a moment where everything settled and the accounting balanced and you could finally stop. The work just continued and you continued in it, and the measure of it was not how you felt at the end, but what the next person walking into a room would find waiting for them. Deirdre Osman was still in the Navy. She'd been offered a transfer to a command where her supervisor was someone Evelyn trusted. She'd taken it. She was 21 years old and she'd been failed, and then, imperfectly and late, she'd been heard, and she was still there. That was not nothing. That was in fact most of what the work was ever for. The game went to extra innings. Evelyn stayed until the 11th, when the home team scored 2 on a single that just cleared the wall and left, and the bar was loud for a moment. Real loud, genuine, no performance in it. And she smiled without thinking about it, and finished her club soda and left a good tip and walked out into the harbor air, which smelled like salt and fuel and something faintly organic from the water, and stood for a moment on the dock looking at the lights across the bay. The strongest person in the room was not always the loudest one, or the most decorated, or the one with the most at stake. Sometimes the strongest person in the room was the one who had already been tested and come through it without losing the thread of what they were there to do, and who was willing to walk back in anyway, knowing it would happen again, knowing the work was long and the outcomes were imperfect and the cost was real. She straightened her jacket. She walked back toward the lights.